he is partially right about my general upbringing. I never wanted for anything, but we did not have an abundance of anything.
The night Frank Sinatra married the most beautiful woman in the world, he had already destroyed his career to do it. It was November 1951. He had just divorced Nancy Barbato, the girl from New Jersey who had loved him before he was anybody, the mother of his 3 children, the woman who stood by him through everything. And he had divorced her because he could not stop himself from wanting Ava Gardner. The affair had been front-page news for 2 years. America had turned on him for it. His records stopped selling. Radio stations pulled his songs. His own fans mailed him hate letters and burned his records in the street. The Catholic Church condemned him. The Bobby Soxers, who had screamed for him a decade earlier, now called Ava Gardner a homewrecker and called Frank Sinatra finished. They were right about finished. By 1952, the greatest singer in America couldn't get a record deal, couldn't get a film role, couldn't fill a nightclub. He was broke. He was so far gone that when he bought Ava a gift, he had to charge it to her account, because he no longer had money of his own. The most famous voice in the world was being financially carried by his wife. And the marriage he had blown up his entire life to have was, from almost the first week, a war. They loved each other with an intensity that frightened the people around them, and they fought with the same intensity. Public brawls, screaming matches in front of packed nightclubs. She would call her ex-husband to make him jealous. He would call her from another room and threaten to kill himself. There were, by the accounts of biographers, actual suicide attempts during that marriage. A man so consumed by a love he couldn't control that he tried to end his own life over it, more than once. This is the part almost nobody understands about Frank Sinatra. The swagger, the Rat Pack cool, the ring-a-ding-ding, the man who did it his way and answered to no one. That was the performance. Underneath it was something that had been there since the day he was born, a day he was declared dead before he took his first breath, pulled out with forceps that scarred his face for life, raised by a mother so domineering and so often absent that he grew up, in the words of one biographer, with a bottomless loneliness and a constant, lifelong need to never be alone. He married 4 times chasing the thing that would fill that hole, a hometown girl who worshipped him, a movie star who matched his fire, a girl 30 years younger than him, and finally, at 60, a woman who stayed until the end. Each of them got a different Frank Sinatra. None of them got the whole man, because there was a piece of him that had gone missing in a Hoboken kitchen in 1915 and never came back. This is the scandalous story of Frank Sinatra's 4 wives, the affair that nearly destroyed him, and the loneliness he spent his entire life, and 4 marriages, trying to outrun. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Frank Sinatra was declared dead before he ever drew a breath. He was born on December 12, 1915, in an upstairs tenement kitchen at 415 Monroe Street in Hoboken, New Jersey. It was a brutal delivery. He weighed 13.5 pounds, an enormous baby, and the doctor had to drag him out with forceps, the metal instruments tearing into the side of his head. When he finally emerged, he was blue and silent and not breathing. The doctor, believing the infant was dead and needing to save the mother who was hemorrhaging, set the lifeless baby down on the kitchen counter and turned his attention to the woman on the bed. It was Frank Sinatra's grandmother who saved his life. She picked up the limp newborn, carried him to the sink, and ran cold water over him, slapping him until, finally, his lungs caught and he screamed. The first sound Frank Sinatra ever made was a scream forced out of a body that had already been given up for dead. The forceps left their mark for the rest of his life. They tore scars down the left side of his face, from his ear to the corner of his mouth. They perforated his eardrum, damage he carried permanently, and which would later keep him out of the war. And they gave the boys on the streets of Hoboken a cruelty to work with. They called him Scarface. He grew up so self-conscious about the scarring that he learned to always be photographed from his right side, a habit he kept for the rest of his career, through thousands of the most famous photographs ever taken. That is how the most celebrated entertainer of the 20th century entered the world, declared dead, scarred, and screaming. His parents were Italian immigrants, and they were not a warm, doting family. His father, Marty, was a Sicilian who had boxed under the Irish name Marty O'Brien because the Hoboken fight gyms wouldn't let an Italian in, and who later became a firefighter. Marty was quiet, gentle, and largely receded into the background of his own home. He never learned to read. The force in the family, the force in Frank Sinatra's entire early life, was his mother. Her name was Natalina, but everyone called her Dolly, and Dolly Sinatra was one of the most formidable women in Hoboken. She was a midwife. She was a saloon owner during Prohibition. She was a Democratic Party ward boss, the first Italian immigrant woman to hold that kind of political power in New Jersey, a woman with 87 godchildren and the ability to deliver votes and swing city elections. And she ran, on the side, an illegal abortion service in the neighborhood, work that earned her a criminal record. She was fierce, profane, domineering, and absolutely in charge of everyone around her, including her quiet husband and her only child. Dolly loved her son, in her way, but her way was overwhelming and conditional and frequently absent. She was consumed by her political work, her midwifery, her saloon, her endless activity in the community. And so the boy who had been pulled dead from her body grew up largely alone, handed off to relatives and neighbors during the day, while his mother ran Hoboken and his father worked. He was an only child, in a household where the parents were rarely present, in a neighborhood where the other boys called him Scarface. The loneliness of that childhood became the single most important fact of Frank Sinatra's psychology, more important than the fame, more important than the talent, more important than any of it. Biographers who have studied him closely keep arriving at the same conclusion. The lonely, neglected boy from Hoboken grew into a man with a bottomless, lifelong terror of being alone. He needed people around him constantly. He kept an entourage his entire adult life, surrounded himself with friends and hangers-on, stayed up until dawn because he could not bear the empty hours, could not bear the silence, could not bear to be by himself with the boy who had been set down on a kitchen counter and left for dead. He would spend his whole life and 4 marriages trying to fill a hole that had opened before he could speak. What Dolly did give him, along with the wound, was ambition and a refusal to accept limits, both of which he inherited from her directly. And when the teenage Frank decided, against his mother's initial wishes, that he was going to be a singer, he pursued it with the same ferocity Dolly brought to everything. He had heard Bing Crosby and decided that was what he wanted to be. He had no formal training. What he had was an instinct for phrasing, a way of holding a note and bending a lyric that made a song sound like a private confession, and a hunger that would not quit. He sang wherever anyone would let him. He got a spot with a local group. Dolly, coming around to her son's ambition, used her political connections to get him bookings. He landed a job with the Harry James Band, then with Tommy Dorsey, one of the biggest band leaders in the country, and it was with Dorsey in the early 1940s that Frank Sinatra learned to control his breath and phrasing so completely that he could sing long, flowing lines without any audible pause, a technique that made his voice sound like it was floating. And then, when he went solo in 1943, something happened that had never happened before in American popular music. Teenage girls, the Bobby Soxers, lost their minds over him. They screamed. They fainted. They mobbed theaters. It was the first time America had seen that kind of mass hysteria around a pop singer, and Frank Sinatra was at the center of it, a skinny kid from Hoboken with scars he hid from the camera, suddenly the most adored performer in the country. But all of that came later. Before the fame, before the screaming, before any of it, there was a girl he had met at the Jersey Shore. A girl who loved Frank Sinatra when he was still just Frankie from Hoboken, a nobody with a nice voice and a lot of nerve. Her name was Nancy Barbato, and she would be the first of the 4 women who tried to love a man who had never quite learned how to be loved. Nancy Barbato fell in love with Frank Sinatra before there was anything to fall in love with except the man himself. They met around 1934, at the Jersey Shore, in a seaside town where both their Italian-American families spent their summers. She was 17, he was 19. She was the daughter of a plasterer, a quiet, warm, practical girl from Jersey City. He was a skinny, cocky kid from Hoboken with big dreams and no money and a 15-minute radio slot on a local station that paid nothing. There was no fame yet. There was no voice yet. Not the way the world would come to know it. There was just Frankie, and Nancy loved him. They married on February 4th, 1939, in the middle of the Great Depression. He was a singing waiter. She was a secretary. They moved into a modest apartment in Jersey City, and Nancy kept working, while Frank chased the thing that everyone except Nancy probably thought was a long shot. She believed in him completely. She was, by every account, the steady ground under a man who had never had steady ground under him in his life. She gave him the home he had never had as a child, the constant, uncomplicated devotion that Dolly had never quite provided. And then the thing happened that changed everything, which was that Frank Sinatra became famous. Not ordinarily famous, historically famous. By the early 1940s, he was the Bobby Sox idol, the singer who made teenage girls faint, one of the biggest stars in America. The couple moved to Los Angeles. Frank became a movie star on top of being a singing star, and the modest life of the singing waiter and the secretary from Jersey was gone, replaced by Hollywood, by money, by adoration, by opportunity of every kind, including the opportunity to be unfaithful, which Frank Sinatra took, almost immediately and almost constantly. The womanizing was not occasional, it was central. Sinatra, the man who could not bear to be alone, who needed constant validation, who carried a wound from childhood that no amount of screaming fans could fill, pursued women relentlessly throughout his marriage to Nancy. And Nancy, at first, did what many wives of that era did. She looked the other way. She knew. Everyone knew. But she had 3 children with him, Nancy Jr., Frank Jr., and Tina, and she had a marriage and a home and a devotion that ran deeper than his betrayals, and she chose, for years, to hold on to what she had, rather than blow it up over what he did. There is a line she gave to a reporter that captures the whole thing. Asked about her philandering husband, she said she had something too fine and precious to give up. She was talking about the marriage, about the family, about the life they had built. She was willing to endure the affairs to keep it. But there is a difference between an affair and an obsession. And in 1949, Frank Sinatra developed an obsession. He had, according to the story he told for years afterward, first been struck by Ava Gardner, not in person but on a magazine cover, back in 1944, the December issue of Photoplay. He looked at the photograph of the young MGM starlet and, by his own account, told a friend, "I'm going to marry that girl." He was married to Nancy at the time. He had children. It did not matter. He looked at a picture of a woman he had never met and announced he was going to marry her, which tells you something about how Frank Sinatra experienced desire. It was not rational. It was total, immediate, and it overrode everything, including a wife and 3 children. A few years later, in 1948, he actually met her, and the fantasy became real. And the real thing was even more consuming than the fantasy had been. Ava Gardner was, at that moment, one of the most beautiful women alive and a rising star at MGM. She was from rural North Carolina, a tobacco farmer's daughter who had been transformed into a Hollywood femme fatale, and she was, underneath the siren image, complicated, insecure, hard-drinking, fiercely independent, and every bit as volatile as Sinatra himself. When the 2 of them collided, it was not a fling, it was a detonation. They fell into each other completely. 2 intense, damaged, magnetic people who could not stay away from each other and, it would turn out, could not survive each other either. And there was a terrible complication in the timing. which was that Frank Sinatra's obsession with Ava Gardner arrived at exactly the moment his career was beginning to collapse for other reasons. By 1949, the Bobby Sox hysteria had faded, musical tastes were shifting. His concerts were no longer selling out the way they once had. The magic that had made him the biggest star in America seemed to be draining away. He was anxious, insecure, and slipping, and into that anxiety walked Ava Gardner, and he grabbed onto her the way a drowning man grabs onto anything. His own publicist warned him. He told Frank plainly that if the affair with Ava Gardner became public, the American public would turn on him, that a married father of 3, carrying on with a Hollywood sex symbol, would be destroyed in the press. It was sound advice. Frank Sinatra ignored it completely, because by then he was not capable of doing anything else. The need was too strong. On Valentine's Day of 1950, Frank Sinatra asked Nancy Barbato for a divorce. The woman who had loved him before he was anyone, who had given him the only stable home he had ever known, who had raised his 3 children and endured his affairs for years because she had something too fine and precious to give up, was being asked to give it up anyway. Not for a passing infidelity, for Ava Gardner. And Nancy at first said no, she refused. She would not divorce him. What followed was one of the ugliest public scandals in the history of American entertainment, and it very nearly ended Frank Sinatra's career for good. When the affair became public, the American public did exactly what Sinatra's publicist had warned they would do. They turned on him, with a fury that stunned even the people who had predicted it. Ava Gardner became, overnight, the most hated woman in America. She was cast as the Scarlet Woman, the homewrecker, the seductress, who had lured a devoted husband and father away from his wife and 3 innocent children. She received sacks of hate mail. She later said the letters accused her of being a Scarlet Woman, and worse, week after week, a relentless campaign of public condemnation aimed at a woman whose only crime, in the public's eyes, was being desired by a married man. But the strange thing, the thing that reveals how differently the culture treated men and women, is that the scandal barely touched Ava Gardner's career. She played femme fatales on screen, man-eaters and sirens, and so a real-life affair with a married crooner simply confirmed the image the studio had already built for her. Her films actually became more popular. The scandal made her more of what audiences already thought she was. For Frank Sinatra, it was the opposite. It was annihilation. His records stopped selling. Radio stations pulled his songs off the air. Fans who had once screamed for him now burned his records in the streets. The Catholic Church condemned him, which mattered enormously to his largely Catholic fan base. He was dropped by his record label. His film contract evaporated. Nightclubs that had once fought to book him would no longer return his calls. In the space of about 2 years, Frank Sinatra went from being one of the most famous entertainers in America to being, professionally, radioactive. By 1952, he was broke, genuinely broke. The man who had earned fortunes was so far gone that he could no longer support himself, and in one of the most humiliating details of the entire collapse, when he wanted to buy Ava a gift, he had to charge it to her account, because he had no money of his own. The greatest voice in America was being financially carried by his mistress. Ava, whose career was thriving while his was in ruins, even had a clause written into her own MGM contract, requiring the studio to find work for Frank. She was, quite literally, keeping him afloat. Through all of this, Nancy held out. For months after the Valentine's Day request, she refused to grant the divorce. It was not spite, or not only spite. She genuinely did not want to give up the marriage, but the situation was untenable. Frank was living openly with Ava. The affair was the most public scandal in the country. Ava herself, insistent and impatient, pushed Frank to force the issue, and eventually Nancy accepted the reality that the marriage was over, that no amount of holding on could bring back a husband whose obsession with another woman had already destroyed his career and would not be denied. The divorce was finalized on October 31st, 1951. Frank Sinatra married Ava Gardner 7 days later, on November 7th, 1951. 7 days. He waited exactly 1 week between ending the marriage to the woman who had loved him before he was anyone and marrying the woman he had burned down his entire life to have. He had gotten what he wanted. He had the most beautiful woman in the world, the woman from the magazine cover, the obsession he had announced years before he ever met her, and it made almost no one happy, least of all the two people who had done it. Because here is the thing that Frank Sinatra could not have understood while he was chasing Ava Gardner through the wreckage of his own career. The hole in him, the loneliness from Hoboken, the need that no amount of love could fill, was not something Ava Gardner could fix. Nothing could fix it. He had convinced himself that if he could just have this one woman, this specific woman, everything would finally be right. But the emptiness was not about the woman. It was about him. It had been there since a kitchen counter in 1915, and no wife, however beautiful, however desired, however hard-won, was ever going to fill it. He had also, in his desperation, chosen the one woman in the world almost perfectly designed to make his particular wound worse instead of better. Because Frank Sinatra needed a woman who would devote herself to him completely, who would be there constantly, who would fill the silence and never leave him alone with himself. Nancy had been that. Ava Gardner was the opposite of that. Ava was fiercely independent, a major star in her own right, a woman with her own career and her own fire, and absolutely no intention of subordinating herself to anyone, least of all a man whose career was in ruins while hers soared. The very qualities that made Ava Gardner irresistible, her independence, her strength, her refusal to be possessed, were the exact qualities that would torment a man who needed to possess the women he loved. Frank Sinatra had spent 2 years and his entire career to win Ava Gardner. He had humiliated his wife, abandoned the stability of his family, and made himself the most reviled entertainer in America to get to this wedding day. And within weeks, the marriage would become a war, and Frank Sinatra would discover that the thing he had wanted more than anything in the world was going to be the thing that nearly killed him. The marriage of Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner is remembered as one of the great love stories of the 20th century, and it was, and that is exactly why it was so destructive. They loved each other too much, in the wrong way, with too little in either of them capable of surviving that kind of intensity. The fights started almost immediately, and they were spectacular. These were not quiet marital disagreements behind closed doors. They were public brawls, screaming matches in front of packed nightclubs, scenes so violent and so operatic that the people around them were frightened. Both of them had ferocious tempers. Both of them drank. Both of them were insecure in ways that fed directly off each other. And both of them, despite being married, continued to be jealous, possessive, and suspicious to the point of madness. There is one episode that captures the whole marriage. One night at the Copacabana, the famous New York nightclub, in front of a packed house, Ava and Frank had an enormous public argument. Furious, Ava stormed off and did the cruelest thing she could think of. She telephoned her ex-husband, the bandleader Artie Shaw, and went to his apartment, knowing exactly what it would do to Frank. She was weaponizing his jealousy on purpose, and it worked. Frank found out, and later that night, back in their hotel suite, he called Ava from a separate room and told her he was going to kill himself. That was not an isolated threat. By the accounts of biographers, there were genuine suicide attempts during the Ava Gardner marriage. Frank Sinatra, the man who projected total confidence and control to the world, was so consumed and so tormented by this relationship that he tried to end his own life over it more than once. The swagger was a mask. Underneath it was a man drowning, a man who had gotten exactly what he wanted and discovered that it was destroying him. The independence that had made Ava so irresistible was, in the marriage, unbearable to him. He wanted to possess her. She would not be possessed. He resented her success, especially at the moment when his own career was in ruins and hers was thriving. She resented his possessiveness, his moods, his neediness. They both cheated. They both raged. And the whole thing burned at a temperature that no relationship could survive for long. There was another layer of pain in the marriage that stayed private for decades. During the years with Sinatra, Ava Gardner became pregnant, and she chose to have abortions, by some accounts, 2 of them. She reportedly said that the marriage was too unstable, that Frank was too consumed by his own troubles, that it was no environment to bring a child into. Whatever the reasons, it was a private grief layered underneath the public brawling. 2 people who loved each other destructively and could not build the ordinary things that love is supposed to build. And through all of it, Frank Sinatra's career remained in ruins, and Ava Gardner did something that would change the course of his entire life. By 1953, Sinatra was desperate for a role in a film called From Here to Eternity, a serious wartime drama. He wanted to play Maggio, a scrappy, doomed Italian-American soldier, a dramatic part completely unlike the crooning matinee roles that had made him famous. He believed it could resurrect his dead career. The problem was that nobody wanted him. He was a washed-up singer in the middle of a scandal, and the studio had no interest in casting him. Ava Gardner intervened. She was still a major star, still had power at MGM and connections across Hollywood, and she used them. She personally lobbied the producer of From Here to Eternity to give her struggling husband a screen test. Whatever exactly she said and to whom, the intervention worked. Frank got the test, and then he got the part. There has been a persistent legend, immortalized in The Godfather, that Sinatra got the role through mob intimidation, a severed horse's head in a producer's bed. That is fiction, a novelist's invention loosely inspired by the swirl of mob rumors that followed Sinatra his whole life. The truth is both less dramatic and more poignant. Frank Sinatra got the role that saved his career largely because the wife he was destroying his life with used her own power to rescue him. From Here to Eternity was released in 1953, and it was a triumph. Sinatra was extraordinary in it. He won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. Overnight, the washed-up crooner was reborn as a serious actor and a respected artist, and the comeback did not stop there. He signed with a new label, began his legendary run of concept albums, and rebuilt himself into something even bigger than the Bobby Sox idol had been. Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board, the greatest interpreter of American popular song who ever lived. The collapse was over. The scandal was behind him. He was, once again, on top of the world. And it saved his career, and it did nothing to save his marriage. Because the very thing that made 1953 possible, Ava's love and Ava's help, existed inside a relationship that was tearing both of them apart. The comeback and the collapse of the marriage happened at the same time. As Frank Sinatra climbed back to the summit of American entertainment, the marriage that had helped put him there was ending. They separated in 1953, the same year as his great triumph. And though the divorce would not be finalized until 1957, the great love story was, in practical terms, already over. But it never really ended, and that is the strangest and most human part of the whole story. Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner divorced in 1957, and they went right on loving each other for the rest of their lives. This is the paradox at the heart of the whole story. The marriage was a catastrophe. It was violent, jealous, destructive, and unsustainable, and both of them knew it had to end. But the feeling underneath the catastrophe never died. They stayed in contact for decades. They spoke on the phone. When Ava Gardner grew old and ill and short of money in her final years in London, it was Frank Sinatra who quietly took care of her, paying her medical bills, making sure she was looked after, staying connected to her until she died in 1990. Ava never remarried. Neither, for a long time, did Frank consider anyone a match for what they had. Each of them, in different ways, spent the rest of their lives measuring other loves against the one that had nearly destroyed them both. Ava said it herself, later, with the clarity that comes long after the fire has burned out. She reflected on what they might have done differently, on whether it could have been saved. It could not have been saved. They were too alike, too damaged, too volatile. But the fact that she was still asking the question decades later tells you everything about how deep it went. For Frank, The years after Ava were the years of his greatest fame and his emptiest personal life. This was the era of the Rat Pack, the Sinatra the world remembers best, the Sands in Las Vegas, Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr., and the whole swinging, tuxedoed, cocktail-in-hand mythology of early 60s cool. Frank Sinatra was the undisputed king of American entertainment, the chairman of the board, a man who seemed to have absolutely everything: the voice, the money, the power, the women, the friends, the swagger, the sense that he answered to no one and did everything his way, and underneath it, the same hole from Hoboken, still unfilled. He surrounded himself with people constantly because he still could not bear to be alone. The all-night parties, the entourage, the refusal to go to bed while there was still anyone left to keep him company, all of it was the grown man managing the same terror the lonely boy had carried. He had endless relationships in these years, with famous and beautiful women, but nothing that lasted, nothing that filled the space. He was, at the peak of his fame, one of the loneliest powerful men in America. Then, in the mid-1960s, he met a young actress named Mia Farrow, and Frank Sinatra did the thing that made even his closest friends wonder if he had lost his mind. Mia Farrow was 20 years old when they met. Frank Sinatra was 50. She was a delicate, wayfish, spiritually searching young woman, the daughter of a Hollywood director and an actress, best known at the time for a television soap opera. She was, in almost every way, the opposite of Ava Gardner. Where Ava had been fire, Mia was air. Where Ava had matched Sinatra's intensity, Mia offered something gentler, younger, stranger. The age gap was nearly 30 years. Frank Sinatra was older than Mia Farrow's own mother by a hair, and his adult daughter Nancy was roughly the same age as the woman her father was courting. The relationship scandalized Hollywood and baffled his friends. Ava Gardner, hearing that Frank was involved with a girl of 20, reportedly delivered one of the great one-liners of the era, saying she always knew Frank would end up in bed with a boy, a cutting reference to Mia's boyish, close-cropped look and slight frame. The whole affair had an air of a man in the grip of something he couldn't quite explain, a 50-year-old at the height of his powers, reaching for something in a 20-year-old that he could not find in anyone his own age. What he was reaching for, almost certainly, was the same thing he had always been reaching for: devotion, attention. Someone who would make the loneliness recede, and a young woman of 20 who idolized him could offer that in a way that a woman of his own age and stature, a woman like Ava, never could. They married in July of 1966. He was 50, she was 21. And almost immediately, the same fundamental problem that had wrecked the marriage to Ava reasserted itself in a new form, because Mia Farrow, for all her youth and her gentleness, was not content to be nothing more than Mrs. Frank Sinatra. She had her own ambitions. She wanted to act, to build a real career, to be a person in her own right. And Frank Sinatra, the man who needed a wife to revolve entirely around him, could not tolerate that any more than he had been able to tolerate it in Ava, even though Mia's version of independence was far quieter than Ava's had ever been. The marriage that everyone had thought was strange from the start was about to end over exactly the thing that had always torn Frank Sinatra's marriages apart. Not a lack of love, a collision between what he needed and what an actual, independent woman was willing to give. And it would end, fittingly, for a man whose whole life had been lived in public, with divorce papers delivered to Mia Farrow in the most humiliating way imaginable, on a film set, in front of everyone, while she was at work. The film that ended Frank Sinatra's third marriage was Rosemary's Baby, and the irony is that it was the film that made Mia Farrow a real star. When they married in 1966, there had been an understanding, at least in Frank's mind, about how the marriage would work. Mia would be his wife. She would travel with him, be with him, revolve around his life and his schedule and his needs the way he required the women in his life to do. For a while she tried. But Mia Farrow was a serious young actress with real talent and real ambition, and in 1967 she was offered the lead role in Rosemary's Baby, Roman Polanski's psychological horror film, a part that any actress would have understood was the opportunity of a lifetime. Frank did not want her to take it. The shoot would keep her working long hours, on someone else's schedule, unavailable to him, building a career and an identity separate from being his wife. By some accounts, he had wanted her to co-star with him in a film of his own instead, to be at his side, rather than off on her own production. Mia took the Polanski film. She chose her career. And Frank Sinatra responded exactly the way he had responded to every woman who chose herself over total devotion to him. He ended it, coldly and publicly. While Mia Farrow was on the set of Rosemary's Baby, in the middle of filming, a lawyer arrived and served her with divorce papers. In front of the cast and crew, at work, she was humiliated and blindsided, handed the end of her marriage on a soundstage while she was trying to do her job, by a husband who could not or would not have the conversation privately, face to face. If that sounds familiar, it should, because it is almost exactly what would later happen to other Hollywood wives, and it fit a pattern that ran through Sinatra's whole approach to endings. When a woman failed to be what he needed, when she asserted an independent self, the response was not a reckoning or a conversation. It was a severing, sudden and public and final. The marriage had lasted barely 2 years. Mia Farrow was 23 when it ended. In later years, she was gracious about it, even self-critical, tending to attribute the failure to her own youth and immaturity, rather than dwelling on his cruelty. She said she had been too young, that she hadn't been ready, that the age gap and her own inexperience had doomed it, and there was truth in that. But the deeper truth was the one that had doomed every Sinatra marriage. He needed a woman to disappear into him, and any woman with a self of her own eventually could not. Remarkably, and this is the pattern that runs through the entire Sinatra story, the divorce did not end the relationship. Frank and Mia remained close for the rest of his life. He was a steady, supportive presence to her in later years, through her own turbulent life, her relationship with Woody Allen, the scandals and heartbreaks that followed. There has even been persistent speculation, which Mia herself has coyly encouraged, that Frank Sinatra may have been the biological father of her son Ronan Farrow, born years after their divorce, during the period when Mia was with Woody Allen. Whatever the truth of that, the fact that it is even a question tells you how deep and how enduring the bond between Frank and Mia remained, decades after the marriage collapsed. This was the strange gift and the strange curse of Frank Sinatra. He could not stay married to these women, but he could not let them go either. Nancy, Ava, Mia, each marriage ended, and yet each woman remained connected to him for life, loved by him in some incomplete but genuine way, unable to fully escape his orbit any more than he could stop needing them. By the early 1970s, Frank Sinatra was in his late 50s. He had 3 marriages behind him. He had briefly retired, then returned. He was the elder statesman of American entertainment now, the voice of a passing era, still magnificent, still filling arenas, still the chairman of the board, and he was still, underneath all of it, the lonely boy from Hoboken who could not bear to be by himself. He had married a hometown girl who worshipped him, and he had betrayed her. He had married a movie star who matched his fire, and they had nearly destroyed each other. He had married a girl 30 years younger, and he had thrown it away when she dared to have a career. 3 women had loved him. 3 marriages had failed. The hole was still there. The loneliness was still there. And Frank Sinatra was running out of decades in which to fill it. Then, in the early 1970s, he met a former showgirl and model named Barbara Marx. She was tall, blonde, elegant, roughly his own generation, and married at the time to Zeppo Marx, one of the Marx brothers, who happened to be Sinatra's neighbor in the desert resort town of Rancho Mirage. She would become his 4th wife. She would be the one who stayed, and after a lifetime of chasing something no woman could give him, Frank Sinatra would finally, at the very end, find something that at least resembled peace. Barbara Marx was different from the women who came before her. And the difference was exactly what Frank Sinatra needed at the end of his life. She was not a fragile young ingenue like Mia, not a volatile equal like Ava, not a hometown innocent like Nancy. She was a mature, worldly woman close to his own age, a former Las Vegas showgirl and model who had lived a full life of her own and understood, from long experience, exactly what she would be taking on by marrying Frank Sinatra. She had been married to Barbara Marx, lived among the wealthy and famous of the California desert, and she came into Frank's life without illusions. She knew who he was, she knew what he needed, and she was willing and able to provide it, in a way that a career-driven actress or a fiery independent star never could. They met in Rancho Mirage, the desert resort town where Sinatra had a home and where Barbara was living with Barbara Marx. Frank and Zeppo were neighbors and friends. Barbara left Marx, and after a courtship that unfolded across the early 1970s, she and Frank Sinatra married on July 11, 1976. He was 60 years old. It was his fourth marriage and her third, and it would be, for both of them, the one that lasted. The wedding was a gathering of an era. Among the guests were Ronald Reagan, soon to be president, and Elvis Presley, and Sinatra's old friend Sammy Davis Jr. It was a coronation of sorts, the chairman of the board finally settling down, and this time it held. The marriage to Barbara was not free of tension. Frank Sinatra was not an easy man, and he never became one. He was still moody, still difficult, still capable of the sudden coldness and the volcanic temper that had run through his whole life. But Barbara understood how to live with it. She provided stability, companionship, a settled home, and above all, a constant presence, which was the one thing Frank Sinatra had needed more than anything since he was a lonely boy in Hoboken. She was there. She stayed. She did not demand that he revolve his life around her career, because she did not have a competing career. She made her life about him, and about the charitable work they did together, including a children's center she founded that Frank helped fund by performing benefit concerts. She built a life that had room for who he was, and she filled the silences he had feared his entire existence. And in the long, mellowing years of that final marriage, something remarkable happened. Frank Sinatra made peace with his past, and specifically with the women in it. He remained close to Nancy Barbato, his first wife, for the rest of his life. She had never remarried. She had raised their 3 children, kept the family together, and stayed, in her quiet way, devoted to the memory of what they had been. There is a story that late in his life, Frank even considered returning to Nancy, that some part of him circled back at the end toward the woman who had loved him before he was anyone. Whether or not that is true, the bond never broke. And Nancy gave the answer that says everything about what Frank Sinatra meant to the women who loved him. Asked, in her old age, why she had never remarried after their divorce, why she had spent the rest of her life alone rather than find another husband, Nancy Barbato Sinatra answered with 2 words. After Sinatra? She had loved him before the fame, endured him through the betrayals, lost him to Ava Gardner, and raised his children alone. And at the end of a long life, she still could not imagine any other man measuring up to him. She died in 2018, at the age of 101. Ava Gardner, the great destructive love of his life, he took care of until her death in 1990, the 2 of them bound together to the end by something that had never stopped burning, even after it stopped being survivable. Mia Farrow remained a lifelong friend. Even the women whose marriages to him had ended in scandal and humiliation stayed, somehow, inside his life. Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998, at the age of 82. Barbara was with him. His last words, reportedly, were, "I'm losing." He was buried in the California desert, near the town where he had finally found something like rest. Barbara stayed his wife to the end and remained devoted to his memory until her own death in 2017. Look at the whole shape of it. A boy pulled dead from his mother's body, scarred for life, raised in loneliness by a domineering mother and an absent father, who grew into a man with a bottomless need never to be alone. He became the most celebrated entertainer of his century, a man who seemed to have everything, and he spent his entire adult life, across 4 marriages, trying to fill a hole that had opened before he could speak. A hometown girl who worshipped him, a movie star who nearly killed him, a girl young enough to be his daughter, and finally, at 60, a woman who simply stayed. He got the fame, he got the fortune, he got the adoration of the entire world, and the greatest voice anyone had ever heard, and a legacy that will outlast everyone who ever knew him. What he spent 4 marriages chasing, and what he may have only found at the very end, in a desert house with a former showgirl who asked nothing of him except to let her stay, was something much smaller and much harder than fame. It was the thing the lonely boy from Hoboken had wanted all along, simply not to be alone. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.